Speaking of firestorms, I don't know if I've ever heard anybody talk about the elevation of the flames, but the burning of Dresden had to have been a fairly uh, horrific event as well because of the kind of, I think they were using kind of like the napalm style bomb at that time. I think they were just kind of refining that as a weapon.
Here's Kamala Harris's house in Brentwood, Los Angeles, uh, in behind the Palisades fire line. So I can imagine her home is burned to the ground at this point. The 5 bathroom, 4 bedroom house bought in for $2.75 million. No, $2.7 million under her husband's name before about 2 years before they got married, and then it was transferred over jointly to their name. Interestingly enough, though the couple are only have a net worth of $8 million get assets, the two have been able to take out $13 million worth of loans from Wells Fargo, despite that Harris prosecuted the Wells Fargo Bank when she was Attorney General of California for billions of dollars.
Big time. My mortgage is with Wells Fargo, and I know all about that. Yeah.
So why is it that Wells Fargo, who was sued by Harris as the Attorney General for billions of dollars, mind you, got a loan from the very same institution for over twice her net worth?
It's called corporate kissing up. Come on, man. Grow up. Right.
That's a topic for a whole discussion if you want to.
That's a whole nother. That is the Minnesota political. Yeah, that's a whole.
Typically, you want to look at
you guys want to
the loan for, but that's a whole different discussion.
You guys want to report from the ground in San Diego? It was just downstream from LA. We've been literally living with bated breath. I was telling Stan last night, some of the best weather we've had all year, idyllic days, and then you go, oh, isn't this wonderful? And then you see the report of the fire and you go, OMG. And I literally drove through embers and flames down I-15 trying to get home from work when we had our Crest fire back in 07 or something. And thanks be to somebody, SDG&E, I believe. We haven't had anything down here, but LA is it's tragic, tragic.
So what's the cause of the low water pressure? Is that because they're
supply and demand, Stan. LA has more water than any city on the planet because they've taken over all of California's water. And San Diego gets whatever they feel like giving us down the pipeline because they own it all. No, it's just if you have a on-demand water heater and you open every faucet in your house, what kind of water pressure are you going to get? None. Very little. You got the sprinkler system going. You got every faucet turned on, every bathtub turned on, every sink turned on. You're not going to have any water pressure. It's that simple. There is no shortage of water whatsoever. And LA Water and Power, which is city owned, is one of the best, have the lowest electric rates in California and a very reliable water system. Thanks to both.
I'm talking about
the reason
that's different than the municipal water.
Yeah. Yes. The reason
it is
the reason the fires are so bad is because in 2023 they had a lot of rain and a lot of growth. In 2024 in LA they had, I think all year they had less than half an inch.
Yeah.
And so,
We get a lot. It's a cycle. We get a lot of water. We get a lot of growth. Then we get no rain for a year and a half.
yeah,
And
so
there you go.
conditions are ripe for this type of thing to happen.
Yep.
You might have drinking water, but try tapping into your local fire hydrant. It's bone dry right now because the fire departments.
No, they're not. You're wrong, Jason. No, they are
Well,
not.
well, that's
I
not.
watch
that's
2,
not
3
what the
hours
fire
of news
department-
a day, local news on LA.
Excuse me, could we raise our hands before we speak and be called on? Tom, would you be willing to call on people?
Sure, I'll call on myself right now.
Um,
I have
You
a son
might
who-
want to think about asking our new people to introduce themselves. We had
Yeah.
three
Okay.
for a minute. One of them has already left.
well,
Raise your hand.
yeah, we
please.
have a couple of names I don't know. There's
Katie
Katie
and
J.
Kite.
If you're interested, you can introduce yourself to us. Katie, you're muted. But if you don't want to say anything, that's fine too. And then we have Kite, looks like, or Kite or something like that.
Kite and Katie and Zoom user.
On the Zoom user, yeah. So
Zoom
if anyone
user's
wants
a
to
regular.
jump in and introduce themselves, that's fine.
Okay, I'm Barbara. I'm Zoom user. I've been part of this group for a long time. So, and yeah, I met most of you in person a long time ago. But for some reason, Zoom will not add my picture in, and I'm not Zoom. Yeah, Meetup, and I'm having a little issue with them. So sorry, but that's me.
Okay. I was going to say, I have a son who lives in Alhambra. It's right next to South Pasadena. And the Eaton fire is the one that's about 2 or 3 miles away from him. Easton. So he says it looks like the evacuation orders have all been canceled now. They're not telling people to leave anymore. So I think he's going to be okay, but it was kind of looking touch and go there for a while. Yeah, go ahead, Dean.
And you're also muted.
The silicon tar pit, and they accidentally clicked a button and they sent out 10 million evacuation warnings alerts to people who were 100 miles from the fire. But that's emergency warning in action. But oh well.
Tom,
Oh, long ago, when my very first job out of the Marine Corps, I was pretending to be a bum in Southern California, and I got a job as a rough carpenter building fences in Topanga Canyon.
Oh, yeah, I know.
But most of that job actually was clearing brush. And at the time, within 100 feet of the building, only a very few specific species were allowed to be more, if it was under 5 foot, how can I say this? Everything was to be cut down to 4 inches, except for some specific things that were more than 5 feet tall. They had people who came out and put little tags on them that they could be saved. Out to 200 feet, it had to be cut down to 8 inches, and to 300 feet, it had to be cut down to no more than a foot. And you're great. You remember this. And oh Lord, was it 20 years later when the America's Cup was in San Diego? We went out there and I took my wife on a drive up to Topanga Canyon to show her the places that had been there. And along the time, those rules had been canceled, and you couldn't see a thing. It was all brush, higher than me. And and it was a dry year, and what are they going to do if there's a fire? I mean, as far as I can tell, they brought this on themselves.
Yep.
And I will grant you, the estates looked like they were not their best with that very close trimming. But the overreaction to let it all grow, well, I suppose there's a benefit to concealing your estate from people on the road. This is a consequence. And these reports of California fires, what do you expect to happen? I mean, 2 years before the mast, written in what, 1800 or thereabouts, he talks about the fires roaring up the canyons. That's California, and you have to prepare for it. And
Yeah.
they ignored it, and
yeah,
there's
two things, Tom. I've lived this for 55 years, right? And I came back from Vietnam. In Vietnam, we had a thing called defensible space. You are supposed to have defensible space. Sacramento is really, really good at passing laws, brilliant laws. Few or none of them are ever enforced. That's the problem. The insurance company, my insurance company, AAA, will come out and say, "Oh, well, that tree is overhanging your house. We're afraid you're going to lose some shingles." In the meantime, you got some yahoo living out in the mountains, in a fire-prone area, and and I pay, in my insurance premiums has to pay for all that. And remember that the billionaires, the Hollywood set in Pacific Palisades, Altadena is a whole nother animal. That's populated by middle-class people, etc. They happen to own $3 million bungalows now, but whatever. But those guys are self-insurable. So their house burned down, they lose some stuff, they just rebuild. They just write a check, So, it's two different planets we live on here. Like everywhere, but especially here.
Yeah. I have a couple things. A $3 million bungalow out there is like a $300,000 or $400,000 bungalow here. But someone, when we were talking about firestorms, had mentioned the bombing of Dresden earlier, and that was undertaken by both the British and the Americans, and that wasn't just a simple bombing. What happened was it occurred in a couple phases. First phase was a bunch of high explosive bombs, to destroy property and such. And then the second wave was incendiary bombs. So it was intentional to start all these fires.
Yep.
There were even some radar guided bombs to take out certain railways and things like that too. So it was a pretty comprehensive bombing intended to destroy the city.
Radar guided bombs in World War II?
Yep. They had radar before the war.
Yeah, thanks to the British. Yeah. And by the way, Dresden was a terror attack. It was a shock and awe. And more innocent women and children were burned alive in Dresden than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in a different horrific way, but that's a fact.
Yeah, tens of thousands were killed.
Yep.
I had a chance to know Kirk Vonnegut Jr. Didn't know him, but I had a chance to meet him. But his book Slaughterhouse 5 was a story based upon that fire.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Warren. Your hand's up. Go ahead.
Yeah, the next big problem, of course, in California will be the mudslides, and I haven't heard anyone talking about that one yet. I mean, there's no way to there's no
Yeah.
way to prevent that, but
Of course, there's no houses left for the mud to slide into, so maybe it's not an issue.
well, yeah, but off, the
It's going to
cliffs
go off.
take care of a lot of things. Yeah,
It takes off the growth soil.
Right.
yeah, especially with really hot hot fires like this, where they haven't taken care of the brush. There's a layer in the soil that organic compounds condense in. I mean, you heat up the soil, there's volatile organics. Some of those organics are condensed on a layer that is cold enough underneath. And that's why when it starts to rain, it'll just wash off. It's a new layer a layer of soil that's impermeable, yeah, partly impermeable. So the water hangs up there and just runs off with the soil.
It's fascinating. Listen, I posted some links into the chat section, the comments section, but I think we did a presentation on wildfires a while back. I remember talking about how California has been criticized for a long time now for mismanaging their forest. I showed a whole bunch of videos on how controlled burning actually goes a long way towards preventing these out of control wildfires. And I actually got many of you to agree with me who don't usually agree with me, because it was such a damning and compelling spectacle. It made such a valid, rational, scientific argument. But my question, I don't think that California is going to have a change of heart anytime soon when it comes to controlled burnings. But my question is this: if we can't control regular wildfire and get them under control and keep whole sections of million-dollar suburbs of Los Angeles from burning to the ground, what's going to happen when we go to war with China over Taiwan and they start dropping hydrogen bombs on the West Coast? What kind of firestorms will those create? And how can the federal government or even the state government, with its current levels of efficiency or lack thereof, begin to manage those types of evacuations or mass casualty situations?
I don't think it's going to happen, but if it did, you're on your own.
If it does, you got more than fire to worry about.
Yeah, and H-bombs is not how China is going to take us over. It's going to be through TikTok, et cetera, and they have been for 50 years, and they've stated it.
So you don't believe that the strong possibility exists, as expressed in the defense community, that there's a strong likelihood that a near-peer war with China over Taiwan won't escalate to nuclear?
Oh, no, that's a very real possibility. Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be the consensus in the Washington think tanks and the Defense Department in general.
Trump isn't going to fight China over Taiwan.
No, and unfortunately, and if, that's what you guys remember Kennedy, Quinoa and Matsui or whatever, where that Nixon and they argued about that. Yeah, we haven't stopped China from taking over. I mean, they're doing the same thing Japan did.
What if they launch a surprise Pearl Harbor style attack across our bases in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, vis-a-vis like a Pearl Harbor style, our airfields and our marine bases, and take out thousands of troops and maybe several ships and hundreds of airplanes, won't we be forced to go to war at that point?
Yeah, but I mean, China has been doing an incremental Pearl Harbor for 20, 30 years, and they're ramping it up.
If they launch a surprise Pearl Harbor style attack across the South Pacific, we might not have a choice whether or not to defend Taiwan at that point.
Which is why they won't do it.
We hope.
The future is kind of hard to predict. This might make a reasonable discussion for another day. It's almost time to
I
start
plan
the
on giving a
presentation.
presentation on it in the near future.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Are you done with, are you willing to stop this discussion now? We have a couple of new people, but we also have a new presenter. Not exactly new, but he did a little presentation for us. Kerry from Seattle is doing our presentation this morning. You're on, Kerry.
Well, all right. Thank you first, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to do a presentation today. Looking forward to it. I think that the topic is a bit tragically timely. So what I'm going to speak about today is a book called The Hidden Life of Trees by a gentleman by the name of Peter Wohilleben. And he's a German forest manager and conservationist. And ultimately, I think the point of the book is about how we manage forests, both for their benefit and our benefit, because there's an interaction there between us. Healthy forests are good for the environment, which is good for us, but yet we utilize timber among other things. A theme that runs through the book is unintended consequences and how we look at systems and how the resolution or the scale that we use and the lens that we as human beings view the world through can lead us to making very poor management decisions when we try to improve upon what already exists. So just to kind of lay the foundation here, a lot of scientifically oriented books, will focus on data and analysis and then the import of the analysis. So this book is not at all focused on data. It is and it's not even much on analysis. So in that way, for the folks that are really looking to get into the nitty-gritty of what the current state of the art on forest science is, will probably be disappointed. He's more interested in the import. In other words, what are the take-home messages? What's the state of the art, and what does it mean? And if I were going to try to, give an example of this, it would be like, I could give you the chemical composition of the glue for, Post-it notes, but that's not going to tell you or give you the idea to use it in that application. So he's talking all about application and less about the nitty-gritty. Book's laid out with short chapters, really easy read, great one to put by the nightstand. And that's kind of how I tackled this one. I think it's 36 chapters. Each one, they're typically 5 pages or something like that each, though. So I've also got a video queued up for a little later, but I'm just going to kind of start marching through the book. But Tom, what's up?
I just wanted to mention that I have a second cousin-in-law or something like that, who's German and lives in Germany, kind of the northern part of the Black Forest area, and he's a forester. And the Germans are really good at managing their forests. That's basically all I wanted to say, but they do make a real science out of it.
Yeah, one of the things I really enjoyed about this is he is very honest about the evolution. When he was a young, forest manager, how, he kind of embodies that Maya Angelou thing about, he did the best he could, but when he knew better, he did better. And he's like, man, we did some really bad practices, or at least the practices that we hoped would do good things ended up being, terrible in the grand scheme of things. So one of the other things I did want to mention that, he challenges, I think the prevailing perspective of that, how we should understand a tree as a living being, and then a network of trees in terms of what is a forest, right? Is it a civilization? Is it a network? Is it just a collection of individuals that, there's this, maybe some emergent properties from, in terms of like climate alterations and stuff like that? I think he pushes the envelope a little bit with this idea that I've seen in other contexts. It's the idea that you can have intelligence without consciousness. And some folks seem to like that idea, or like to understand things that way, where as long as you have a system that can adapt and develop strategies, you can call that intelligence, even though it has no consciousness whatsoever. And I'm thinking of computer systems primarily. And he extends that to trees as being more than just purely reactive, but embodying intelligent responses to stimulus. And they do it not only individually, but in groups. Now, the language he uses might go a little far. He talks about them, feeling pain and things like that. And I'm not sure he even necessarily believes that they feel it in the same way that we do. But I think in context, it's an interesting way to kind of stretch how you think about these things. So he opens up the book by sharing an anecdote where he comes across this stone, and it's covered in moss, and he examines this thing and realizes it is like an old stump, like maybe 100 years old. And he takes his knife and he's like kind of scraping the moss off because he's intrigued by this thing for some reason, and finds that under the layer of bark, there's still green. And he's like, what's going on? This thing is alive. And it was cut down, decades ago. And what's going on is apparently trees will share nutrients with each other. So if there is a sick tree, the one next to it will help nourish it, and vice versa. So while, we tend to focus on competition a lot, there's this idea of a forest balancing the amount of energy absorption at the canopy level, and then sharing the sugars and nutrients and whatnot through this underground network of roots and fungi, which is it balances in the same way that an electrical grid might try to do. But it also, there's bias between what they call mother trees and daughter trees. So the way he describes it is not only is there's communication between trees, but there's care. And part of it is to encourage slow growth. There's this idea that foresters like fast-growing trees, and they want to encourage them to grow quickly, because the faster you can grow a harvestable tree, the more paper or lumber or whatever you get from it, and more profit. And forestry is a long-term game. It's going to take 100 years to, get a tree up to that extent. So largely forest managers are always thinking about what the next generation is going to do and how the previous generation has set them up for what they're planning on harvesting now. So what the trees want to do, though, is there will be a large tree that will sequester nutrients for the daughter trees and artificially restrict their ability to grow, so they grow slowly, which encourages denser wood. And later, that makes them more resistant to fungal attacks and insect attacks and whatnot. So what we do is when we go into a forest and we harvest all of the mature trees, we kill all the mother trees, we leave all the daughter trees, they lose their support network, they get access to a lot of light and more resources, they grow a lot faster, and now they're susceptible to insect and fungal attacks, et cetera, et cetera. So in the long term, we're actually creating a less healthy forest. Now, it takes a while for folks to figure this out, but this is kind of the irony. So I guess one of the strategies would be, when you are managing a forest, is to leave some of these large trees to help encourage this network. He also goes into the idea of tree communication. So a tree can send signals to different parts of itself, but it's very slow. So if it is attacked by a particular insect, say, to get a chemical signal from this branch all the way through to the other branch and whatnot, because they do have defenses, right? They can actually release chemicals that will discourage these pests. But what's faster is to release aerial chemical signals that not only signal to other parts of the tree much more quickly, but will signal to adjacent trees. And this is another area where density is important for the forest, right? Because one tree sends out a signal, it might get maybe 100 feet. But then those trees can signal other trees. And this type of defense, I think he gives at least 3 different examples. One is if a giraffe starts eating one tree, the other trees will start to produce chemicals that make the leaves bitter, encouraging the giraffes to move on to another stand of trees. Another one would be something like willows that produce, what is it, salicylic acid, whatever the precursor to aspirin is. You know,
Salicylic acid.
Thank you. You know, which gets, it's also kind of a side point that, you know, a lot of our drugs and pesticides and all of this stuff come from plants and their natural defense mechanisms, you know, things like nicotine, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be another defense mechanism. And this one I did not know about, but I found fascinating. There's at least one situation where a certain type of pest will attack a tree, and it will send out a chemical signal that will attract wasps that prey on that particular insect. So I've already mentioned the idea of how forest density creates this ability for them, for individual trees to share energy, balance it, equalize it, creates a support network where they support each other. What's fascinating is that while trees will compete with each other of different species and individuals, they will actually share nutrients within different species as well. There seems to be this natural, I don't know, understanding, I use that word cautiously, that it is an advantage to have a dense enough forest that will keep competitors healthy, because that's better for all of us than it is to shut down one particular species or the other. And this also gets into the idea of another thing we do is encourage monocultures. It's a lot easier if we want fir trees to grow nothing but fir trees. And that is not necessarily the best option. let's see.
For questions?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
This is fascinating, entirely believable, but it would need to have a theoretical basis on based on natural selection, based on reproductive success,
Mhm.
based on the individual trees trying to optimize their own reproductive success
Mhm.
because they have different DNA. This isn't like a ant colony where they cooperate because they have the same DNA. So this is all fascinating stuff, but is there a theoretical basis on evolutionary theory to explain why they would do this? You would think in evolutionary theory there are incentives for cheaters. Cheaters can get all the benefits and not pay any of the costs, and the cheaters would have greater reproductive success. So are all these ideas supported by natural selection and random variation? And you say something like these trees share their resources. That is kind of a loaded term in a sense. It may be that other trees exploit the resources of each other. So that's kind of my basic thing.
All right, Dean, did you want to comment?
Let me unmute. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about two different species that share very little DNA, although we share 90% with the fruit fly. But symbiosis, I believe that's the term, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, ask Darwin, I guess. But yeah, symbiosis is very, very important and has been for millennia and beyond.
Sounds good. Jason, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to say that sir. I'd like to say that I agree with everything Warren Christoffel has said, and that I've drawn much the same conclusions, processy wise and evolutionarily. No, you or I might not be able to, at this particular moment, offer the specific mechanism by which that occurs. I would venture to, if I might be so bold, state that by its very mere existence of the process, it must be the case, because if form follows function, it wouldn't have evolved that way unless it was so. Meaning that if we are correct in our understanding, me and William, of what he just stated, then that has to be the case, because it wouldn't have evolved otherwise.
I see we've got some agreement and some disagreement there. Okay.
I agree with you. It had to be the case or it wouldn't have evolved otherwise, but still you need to explain why this had to be the case.
Yeah. And this is exactly why I was saying that a lot of this has to do with the import rather than he gives you, here's the information, here's my way of understanding this, or the current state of the art way of understanding it. But I think there's a little more to dive into here, but let's hear what David has to say.
I was just going to suggest that represents data, and the explanation may follow the data, which usually happens.
Yep.
Okay. H-Tom?
Cheaters can't leave. You can't pull up roots and move to the next community.
Great point. Yeah, that does put trees in a very, very different situation than most animals, let's say. For sure. Tom.
Yeah, I could see that this type of behavior could arrive naturally and not necessarily consciously. It's not a decision that they make, but in diversity, there is strength. And so I could see that it would be evolutionarily advantageous to help other species of trees as well as their own daughters. So I could see how that could arise naturally.
Carol, you're up.
Yes, something I have read about apropos reproduction in trees is that if you have a tree that puts out fruit, it often does not work to take the seeds from the apples of this tree and plant them and get apples that taste like the ones on the tree. Very often, the only way to reproduce that particular kind of fruit is by grafting. And so that's got to affect our notions of Darwinian competition and reproduction and
Carol, it's a really, really good point. And this is something in another context I bring up with folks who are talking about human diet and specifically like the paleo diet. And it's like, oh, we should eat like our ancestors do. And it's like, none of the foods we eat were available to folks 100,000 years ago, right? We have bred these things selectively. I mean, you taste an apple that you find out on the trail and it tastes terrible. Right. For exactly that reason. So that's a very good point. The other thing I think that you bring up grafting, and this is huge because like if you think about people, we can't just share organs with each other or blood. I mean, it's like how many different blood types are there? I forget off the top of my head, but it's like, you have to be careful. And to accept a transplant, you have to suppress the immune system, find somebody who's got, what is it, like 7 factors that match to the highest degree possible, et cetera, et cetera. Trees aren't like that at all. You can get a grafted tree that grows 4 different kinds of fruit, which is just amazing, right? So there's definitely a lot more inherent compatibility there, and ironically, a lot more genetic complexity. They've got way more going on at that level than most animals do. But I also just wanted to comment that on the use of loaded language, and I think this is a great example of this, is this idea that we can say, well, these trees are sharing. Okay, that's one way to understand it. Or we can say, well, this tree is exploiting this feature. That's another way to understand it. It has incredibly different meanings to us. I don't think the tree has any sense of meaning whatsoever. It's just this thing that happens. So, we look at these systems and as they evolve, and then we try to come up with explanations that make sense to us. I'm not so sure there is an explanation in terms of our human language. There's this entire set of circumstances that lead to this result, but we don't work well with that, right? We need the story. And I think that's one of the things that we need to be careful of, because all of our stories, they have implications that we may not see, and we'll get to that moving on. But Dean, what's up?
Hang on, unmute. Yeah, I a whole lot of the things, but if I read my my evolution of the Earth correctly, plants had what? How many 100 million years had started us at figuring out Darwin?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Carol.
Yeah, I think some interesting cognitive work has been done on the parallels between instinct in animals and trophisms in plants. And that might give you a way of looking at this, that there are certain behaviors that are built in, that are instinctual in a particular species of animal. I mean, for instance, we have definitely shown that there is an instinctive visual fear of falling that is there in babies. Some lovely experiments have been done on this. Babies crawling around on elevated platforms that have, clear glass in places.
Mhm.
And I think you can get some really good cognitive parallels between the trophism that makes the plant spread out and try to get the light, or the trophism that is water seeking, and parallels between that and instinctive behavior that gets built into animals by natural selection.
So I'm going to jump ahead just for a little bit because what you said is right on point. And I think this gets into one of my critiques of the book is the author will say something really provocative and then not explain it enough for me to make my own decision on exactly what the details are. So I need to go to an alternate source. But he made the comment that there are brain-like structures at the growth ends of roots. Now, I want to know what the hell that is. He doesn't really go into it, which is really unfortunate. But as roots travel around through their growth, they can self-direct one direction or another, up or down. They'll find loose soil, and that's a mechanical process, you would think. But they also can select and reject certain paths based on the chemical signals that they're getting in a certain area. And one of the things he did say, which I thought was fascinating, is when you buy a tree at the local tree farm, because it's impossible for you to dig up an entire root structure of a tree, they cut the roots off very short, put it in a burlap sack. You've got this root ball with this tree stuck out of it, and then you go and plant it. And apparently you have now, through that process of pruning off all these roots, you've clipped off all of this apparatus that helps guide the roots. So now you have essentially blinded the root structure of the tree. And it's unclear to me whether or how long it takes to regenerate those structures. So that's something that I would want to look into more. But there's the whole back half of the book. There's a great chapter on the plight of trees in cities and urban environments. That if you ever wanted to feel bad for trees, that's a good chapter to read. But we can get into that later. Okay, Carol, do you have anything else to say on that?
Just a quick parallelism to what you just talked about, brain-like structures at the end of roots. I believe it was the Brontosaurus in dinosaur land that had a brain-like structure on the end of its spine that did nothing but direct the activities of the tail.
Right. Well,
so a parallelism.
Nerve signals only travel so quickly, and bigger animals, that's a challenge. It's one of the reasons why mice can be, they can change direction and be very, very coordinated, but something like an elephant, they kind of have to anticipate where their legs are trying to be at any particular moment.
Yeah.
But good point. Dean.
Am I muted? No, I'm not. When you transplant a tree, we're essentially doing a lobotomy on the tree. And who's to say? Well, I'll say it, that the idea of neural networks was created hundreds of millions of years, a rudimentary neural network happened in plants, and then somehow or another that went into the animal kingdom. That makes sense to me.
Sounds good. This is, you're anticipating the section that's coming up, which I think is the most fascinating, is the network by which trees communicate, which actually uses fungi.
Yep.
But Tom.
Yeah. The fungi are the largest living organisms on the planet, far and away.
Yep.
Yeah. In animals also, many of them have distributed brains, you might say, distributed neural networks.
Octopi.
For example, yes, have brains down their legs, you might say, whatever you want to call them. And how they coordinate is very interesting. But I'm sure trees have a way to coordinate also their root systems and of course their leaves and so forth. So I'd be interested in learning how they do that.
Well, that's awesome, because there is seems like traditionally we like videos here. So I've got it's about a 15-minute video that's exactly on that, and I'm sure it presents that section way better than I can. So we'll get into that in just a second. But Jason.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say, since we brought up this topic of how brains and plants or even humans could be distributed, for example, intelligent parts of the plant could be in the roots, just like humans have been accused of having intelligent organs, like the human gut, for example, having a mind of its own. I have a hypothesis on this, and I don't have anything to back this up, but if somebody does have something to add, I'd be interested. I believe one of the external factors or elements that cause different parts of the plant to be intelligent in its own way or react what we anthropomorphize as intelligent, even in humans, I think this has a lot to do with the external sources of the world of the microbiome, or viruses and bacteria interacting with the host species itself in ways that appear intelligent. And this can form a symbiosis or a homeostasis to allow plants and animals to obviously extract nutrients and fight disease and aid digestion and all that. But maybe what we think of different parts of the plant or human body being intelligent is due to those external commonalities at the microcellular level. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point as well. I think that this gets into this idea that sometimes very, very simple structures or mechanisms can yield very complex results. I don't think it's an accident that when you look at fractal geometries, you'll see patterns sometimes that look very similar to plants. You'll see, oh, this equation here, good, that looks like a fern. And when you look at the genetic structure of plants and whatnot, I mean, where are these structures encoded and how complex are they? And it looks like they don't have to be that complex to yield these very complex structures. Things like the branching mechanisms of blood vessels in an animal body. Pretty simple process, but it yields these incredibly complex structures. Another one is slime mold behavior, where they will negotiate a maze to find food. And again, very, we kind of understand that, how it works. It's very simple, yet it yields seemingly very intelligent activities. Tom.
Yeah, I was just wanting to comment that we like to use these words consciousness and intelligence, and we worry about whether other species have them. Maybe we shouldn't worry about that. I mean, they're actually kind of slippery concepts. And even, consciousness has been debated for a long time, but even intelligence, what really is that? And why should we care? It's the behavior itself that is interesting, and whether the cause is a certain kind of intelligence that, as Jason said, we tend to anthropomorphize, or because we're a very anthropocentric type of species. I don't know if that's important. Is it intelligent or not? I don't know, but it's very interesting in and of itself.
Really good point. And I think this kind of takes us all the way back around to where we were, is that's the idea of how we explain things. And the next chapter, I think, is a great example of this, about a behavior, which we can just look at the behavior, and then we try to figure out, well, what function does this have? Right? If we want to get away from reading too much purpose or intent into it, it still has a function, and we can understand it that way. So the author is really familiar with beech trees. That seems to be one of his specialties. And one of the things apparently that beech trees do is they don't set their nuts every year. They will skip 2 or 3 years. So there'll be a year that's flush with beech nuts, and then they'll be dry for 2 or 3 years. And then they'll do it again. And the explanation apparently is that if they set these nuts every year, it would support a lot of wildlife that would eat them. Right? And the last thing the trees want to do is create an environment that encourages lots of wild boar and deer and whatnot to be eating all of their seeds. So what they'll do is they'll starve the critters, create an environment where there's no food for them. And then when they set out this massive coordinated, fruit drop, there enough will survive to keep the forest going. And then they'll continue to starve them or whatever, and then, do this like every 2 or 3 years. So, I don't know if that, obviously I don't know. I don't believe that the trees know this at any level. Of course not. But I think we can say that seems to be a very functional way of accomplishing the goal, or creating an environment that's better suited for the trees. Because certainly if people set out food, you will encourage the animals to propagate, and soon there'll be tons of them, right?
That's a phenomena that could easily be explained by evolution.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
a tree that did that would drop more seeds, would have more reproductive offspring. It would spread, that gene would spread to the advantage of trees that didn't do that. And
Yep.
it's not so much coordination and sharing and communication. It's spreading the gene to do that because of reproductive success.
So I think all of this is explainable via natural selection. I'm not trying to say that there's they're getting together and planning this stuff out, but there is communication because the trees all set the nuts at the same time.
But that's not necessarily communication. That is that gene spreading because of reproductive success.
But
is that the same as communication?
Well, no. But what I'm saying is that it's not that they just set fruit every 3 years or every 2 years. It's a little more random than that. But all of the trees in that area, I don't know if it's the entire forest, will do it at the same time.
Because they have the same gene, because the tree who first started doing that had greater reproductive success.
But how do they know which schedule that they're on?
They have the same gene for doing that.
No, they actually communicate chemically.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there's this idea that if you have the beech trees in this forest and the beech trees over here, it's not like every 4th year evens or odds, or it's not formulaic. I mean, obviously there is some kind of formula, but there's like a coordination process at most. I'm not going to call this like a democracy and they're having a council and voting, but I suppose you could understand it that way too. I've heard somebody talk about the bees' decision when to swarm and where to go. There is a decision-making process based upon what information the scouts bring back. And the hive has a decision-making process. I don't think it looks anything like, Congress or anything like that.
Yeah, I would need more information on the beech tree to know if it is a simple spreading of genes or if it's more complex than that.
Agreed. Agreed. H-Tom.
I'm struck with the idea of Congress being intelligent.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
I was going to ask if the beech trees herd the animals. This year, the ones on this hill don't drop nuts, but the ones on this hill do. And they herd the animals around the forest, by which group is dropping nuts.
Oh, herd as in
Sense of vibrations.
collie dogs herding, not herd as in ears.
Yeah, no, this is the year the hogs go this way because the things will be there. And what's the color?
Yeah, I'm still not clear. Is that herd with an A or
Herd?
Yes.
Thank you.
Funnel them from one place to another.
Mm-hmm.
That's a compelling idea. I don't know if that has been studied. It's not covered in the book. That would be fascinating, though. Carol.
Yeah, you reminded me of another parallel between animals and your trees. With the, somewhat random, well, we'll drop our nuts this year, but not next year sort of thing. If you have a bunch of women living together in close proximity, same house, same, their cycles will converge. I mean, you get, okay, all the women in the dorm coming in freshman year, and they've got cycles that are scattered all through the month. And the longer they live together, the more their cycles converge. And this is related to, there's an extreme, okay, estrogen is extremely dependent on fat mechanisms. And starving women don't get pregnant. And that sort of thing. That sounds very much like your trees dropping selectively.
I love that analogy. I would not be surprised if that's exactly the same, the kind of signaling that goes on. Do we know why or how that actually works?
Pheromones are involved.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, clearly there's a signaling that is I'm sure airborne at some level, but yeah, fascinating. Stan.
I saw a TED talk, this must be maybe 12 to 15 years ago, featuring Barbara Bassler, who is a biology and structure from Princeton, at the time she was anyway, about how bacteria communicate. And the theme of that was quorum sensing, which means that they detect when there's a lot of them there. And the research was started out with the fluorescent quality of fluorescing bacteria, fluorescing, underwater aquatic sea creatures that fluoresce. And they detected that when there was a fluorescent bacteria, when they get sufficiently enough of them together, what they call a quorum, that's when it triggers the flash of light, the quorum sensing. And I'm not sure whether this is anything to do with what we're talking about, but I think it's a mechanism that kind of explains on a bacterial level how they communicate. And that one of the other facets to that talk is that they had both a interior, they had a way of communicating with their own particular bacteria species, and they also had a second way of communicating with other bacteria species.
Yeah, and another example of that are what are these fungi that will come together and form separate structures in times of stress. There'll be a stalk and a fruiting body and all this stuff. And it's like, the ones that are the anchor or the stalk don't get to reproduce, right? It's only the one that forms the fruiting body and there's this interesting idea of how this symbiosis evolved where it's like, look, it's time we need to, do this for the good of the continuation of our kind, so to speak. Again, they're not thinking this, it's just natural selection, but that this is advantageous overall to kind of say, all right, I'm going to be the one that's going to lift you up, this other compatriot up, and let it do its reproduction thing. Jason.
Sorry, I wasn't able to raise my hand fast enough immediately, but I think we are anthropomorphizing again in terms of assigning a hierarchical structure to the plant kingdom, where we are observing such in the animal kingdom. For example, we were just speaking, Carol rather was speaking about the example she took about how in dormitories, and this is well established, that their cycles sync up with each other. Now, we obviously don't have as sensitive a sense of smell as some animals. It's quite well known and established that bears, for example, can detect a human female cycle than other humans can. This is a much is in the background in the subconscious level, but for example, in wolf packs, there's alpha and betas, there's a hierarchical structure. The reason I say this is because it's random. For example, it's clearly established that women sync their cycles when they live together based on the dominant female of the group. They match that particular female's cycle, and all of them follow that one woman's cycle. That's just a hierarchical structure. Whereas I'm not to trees and plants. It could be much more. It could not be. It's very probable, or possible rather, that it's not as rigid a hierarchy. It could be a more diversified some standards or rules. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I need to know a lot more about that, because that's you've just gone beyond what I know about it. I was not aware that there were
we should be
dominant.
careful. We should be careful when we're talking about things that we don't understand, to compare and contrast set of processes in a mammal species and a plant species. I'm sure they follow completely alien processes and are guided by different sets of principles.
Well, there's mechanisms, and then there's function, and then there's analogies, right? And I think we can definitely say that there are functional analogies, right?
Yeah, we don't know how functional they are. We're taking.
I mean, we talk about this kind of stuff. Oh, the kidneys are for the elimination of waste, and it's like, well, you've just described a purpose and an intent and all of this stuff. That's certainly what they do, right? And it's if we didn't speak like that, we'd have a really hard time communicating. So, but I totally agree. We need to be at least aware when we're doing it, that you've got these processes that are happening and they appear to have certain functions, because sometimes we get it completely wrong, which we will get to later. One last point I wanted to make about the beech trees that I thought was important. Apparently, a single beech tree that lives to maturity, which is, many hundreds of years, through its life will produce something like, over 1 million beech nuts. And on average, they'll maybe get one offspring that will survive to maturity, which is kind of fascinating. So it's a rare event. Now, that doesn't mean that there's only one that actually, roots, but in terms of actually making it to, full maturity, it's a rare process. Okay. So the next topic, I think I was going to go into this communication network under the soil. And this might be a great opportunity to do the video if you guys want to see that.
Sonic bloom, and the sonic bloom would help the plants grow faster. But then what he did, and he spent his whole life working on this, he then added music to the thing, and it ended up that we had some trees out in the Minnetonka area that we had the DNR looking at. And they just could not believe that we could get trees to grow as fast as that. He had a whole grove of stuff. And when I first heard this, I thought, oh, this is a bunch of baloney. But then I worked with him for a number of years, and like the apple farmers over in Wisconsin were actually using this. And I ended up walking out in an apple orchard, and wherever the sound boxes were, you could tell there was absolutely a lot more apples on the tree. That was kind of the day that I started to believe what he was doing. But it was just fascinating to see. And he even worked with some farmers down in Iowa, and all of a sudden they were getting much better crops. And then a couple of years later, they quit using it. And I asked him, I said, well, why would that happen? He said, all the neighbors were all teasing them that this was just something that was a bunch of baloney. But, he proved it so many times in so many ways. He actually was hired to go over to the islands that are being built in the Middle East, and where they're putting homes on these islands, and nothing can grow. He used it there to get plants growing. He was invited to England to work with their big gardens there. It was just fascinating. And he always said, Doug, you'll find out that once I pass away, people will, make this work better. But he said, in my lifetime, he said, I've just never, I'm sorry, I'm telling this long story, but anyway, he started this because he wanted to grow more food. And when he was in the Korean War, he had a mother put her child under a Jeep, and the Jeep ran over the child just so she could qualify for more food. And it just affected him for his whole life. And his whole thing was to work with this stuff called sonic bloom. So anyway, just a kind of a side note there of a guy that locally has done some amazing stuff.
Doug, do you know if anybody has managed to figure out how that works? The mechanism by which music impacts growth?
There has been some more people working on it. I think there was, and he passed away a couple of years ago, and his son took it over. And the place, we used to go out to his place, and we would pick these black walnuts in the fall. And he had trees growing on that place that were never supposed to grow in this part of the state or the country. And we would plant them and then spray this substance on them. And it was a secret sauce that he had come up with, which was made up of like seaweed and I don't know what else it was. And but I don't know. When he passed, his son kind of did it a while, and then he got into aquaponics, and it just kind of went away. And there was somebody out in the Seattle area that supposedly took on what he was working on and is still working on it. But that's about all I know about it.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Carol.
Yes. Something that we haven't mentioned yet is the really basic distinction between nitrogen fixing plants and nitrogen sucking plants. And, the basis of crop rotation as opposed to artificial fertilizers.
Yeah, I know that there's that idea of like, oh, I'm going to plant beans because they're nitrogen fixers and it'll help the plants that are next to it and things like that.
Or it'll help next year's crop of nitrogen sucking things.
Right. The idea of rotating and plowing under. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although then there's a lot of folks who are like, plowing's not such a great idea because you're, absolutely destroying that kind of hierarchy of the microbiome in the top, the layer of soil. There's a lot of debate on the benefits and of that. Dean.
Unmute. Yeah. Something always pops up. Yeah. My neighbors, it's a long story, but I own 37 acres in Missouri, in farmland. And yeah, the corn beans thing has been going on for decades. Yeah, absolute decades. Now, the music thing, the hippy dippies out here on the West Coast found that to be true for house plants back in the 70s and 80s and did their own controlled experiments in their house. And they go, hey, this guy's got rock and roll, this guy's got classical, and he does better or whatever. Yep.
Yeah, I remember those stories, but I still, I mean, you figure somebody would have come up with, is it just the micro agitation of the air kind of helps, or is there something other? I don't know.
I don't know that anyone knows. But then again, let's talk about the Big Bang and the expanding, accelerating universe, and nobody knows.
It's all fun though. David.
As regards to sonic bloom, my recollection of the little bit of looking into that I did a couple years ago is that the sounds that they were playing were similar to what the birds and the bees and
Yep.
the sounds that you would experience early in the morning. And the response of the plants was to open up the pores on the bottom of the leaves to be able to absorb more moisture and absorb any of the fertilizer. And that was when they were spraying the fertilizer. So the plant leaves were actually absorbing more fertilizer than they normally would have without the sounds that they normally would expect early in the morning. So there were some studies to explore what the cause and effect was associated with this extra stimulus, if you will.
Okay, that's fascinating. It actually ties into there's a chapter in the book where he's talking about the sensory mechanisms of trees in terms of how they can calculate time, right? Because trees need to time themselves according to the time of year, whether they're going to go dormant, whether they're going to set fruit, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this, they are both light sensitive, temperature sensitive, and sensitive to other things. And apparently they can learn. Again, I'm going to throw that word into quotes, but there was an experiment with a particular type of tree. I forget the name of it right now, but when you touch it, it has these little leaves in a row and they'll fold up, right, to kind of protect themselves. So what they did was they started just dropping water, gently on these things, and it would close up as soon as the water fell on it. But then over time, apparently it moderated that behavior because it was, there was no damage, right? So then the leaves would remain open and it retained that knowledge over time. Kind of an interesting anecdote. Doug.
Yeah, David stole my story there. That's exactly what this guy worked with. He worked at the University of Minnesota for years, working out the particular frequencies that were effective, and it opens up the stomata in the bottom of the leaf to take in moisture. And like I say, it was pretty well accepted all over the world, actually, what he was doing. Um, anyway, but anyway, David hit it right on the head, what he was saying.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I mean, and there's a lot of work being done also with how they signal to pollinators. And that's not just trees, but various plants generally. But H-Tom.
Yeah, tillage is complicated. I remember back in the 60s, we used to sell what were called subsoil plows, which would dig down 2, 3, 4 feet and rotate the soil. And you don't see much of that being done anymore. But and then there was a fad for no tillage, where you would just have little scratches and put the seeds in the scratches, and then it keeps changing, but it's I haven't been a big study on this, but it seems that it's moving towards a rotation of tillage methods to minimal, not non-tillage, but minimal tillage for a couple of years, and then do a deeper harrowing, and then go back to, and then an even deeper, so that you're keeping it stirred, but not as being as disruptive.
Well, I think this is another example of what the paradigm that we're using to understand what we're trying to accomplish shapes how we approach it, right? I mean, a lot of, commercial farms were just like, I want density, I want production at all costs. And then you look at somebody like, was it Joel Salatin from Polyface Farms? He's doing this kind of regenerative farming with, rotating grazing animals and then poultry and then growing grass and cycling, and he can actually increase topsoil.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool, because that's one of the things that the more commercial processes that we've been fixating on, it
Very
decimates.
destructive.
Precisely. And, and I don't want to suggest that, we should abandon any one particular approach, but try to integrate these things and find something that works for what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
And probably it's going to be certain approaches are going to work better in certain circumstances. Tom.
Yeah, two things. I remember when I was at the state fair a couple of years ago, in the eco building, they were talking about this new plant they had developed, which was kind of a replacement for wheat, but it wasn't an annual, it was a perennial. And you didn't have to dig up the soil for it to reproduce the next year and replant everything. Forget the name of it, but
Wow.
Doug would probably know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
The other thing I wanted to mention or ask about is this learned behavior you were talking about, such as the reaction to gentle rain or something like that. Is there any research onto whether that learned behavior can be transmitted to the offspring of the plant, or even through communication to neighboring plants, contemporary plants?
I do not know the answer to that, but that sounds like something ripe for doing some inquiry on, for sure. And yeah, fascinating question.
Okay.
Dean.
I think I lost my train of thought. I'll lower it and come back to it.
Okay. H-Tom.
Yeah, we've lost a lot of topsoil in this country. There were places where topsoil was considered to be 10 to 12 feet deep, and it's now down to inches. And there are a number of causes for this, but the primary cause is tillage, because it breaks up the root structures that keep it from blowing away or being driven away by water. And this is what's driving the minimal tillage thing. And the idea of increasing topsoil is just, oh yay, there's future for us. Because you can't grow much in subsoil.
Boy, ain't that the truth. All right, Dean, do you remember?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, something new pops up. Yeah, I live in Southern California. What is topsoil? Remind me, because we don't have it. Yeah, we have to make our own.
No,
here.
you don't.
And well, but the food basket of the world, Imperial Valley and San Juan, or for the country, yeah, it's complicated. Anyway, you mentioned tomatoes or you mentioned perennial, annual. My first house in Mira Mesa, somebody had thrown some cherry tomatoes in the front little garden area, and they became perennials. I had a lattice there. I was trying to grow ornamentals, whatever, and the darn cherry tomatoes would take that over every year, and they were delicious cherry tomatoes. Came back every year.
Cool. So one of the take homes I got.
Excuse me. For some reason, I believe my hand is not showing, but I've had my hand up for a while.
Oh, it has not been showing. I am so
Doesn't
sorry.
show.
No, I think, I'm sorry. Like I said, I've been having trouble with Meetup and trying to fix that. But anyway, I've been mulling over what I think Kite just left the meeting, but what Kite mentioned about the different teams of trees, and do they gang up on other trees if they, wanted to take over the forest or something like that. And I was just kind of mulling over the fact, what we're dealing with here in Minnesota and maybe other places as well, with buckthorn. Because it's almost like buckthorn, if you cut a buckthorn down, 15 more of them spring up in its place. And they are taking over certain parts of, various managed and unmanaged forests. I happen to live next to a strip of forest with old growth oak trees, which I'm very proud of, but I have noticed that they're going through a decline. And part of it is the buckthorn, which is actually not in my property, is on my neighbors behind me that live in a different association, et cetera, and they don't cut that back. But I've just been wondering if somehow the buckthorn isn't poisoning some of the trees. And I know that's not really what we were talking about here, but I just found it interesting that Kite brought it up in terms of teams and competition.
Or do you know if the buckthorn is native?
It is not native. It was brought here.
Yeah. Dean.
Yeah, so am I muted? No. Yeah, back to I think H-Tom's point about topsoil. The first house in Mira Mesa, we were early pioneers up there. And behind our home was acres and acres of live oak forest that was going to get bulldozed and become homes. My brother and I spent months out there in his little Chevy Love pickup raking up leaf mold and composting it in my driveway and built amazing topsoil out of that stuff. But
Yeah.
it's all disappearing.
Yeah, I think that gets to a point. I think at the tail end, I'll kind of close into this is forest management practices, particularly because that seems to be right on, everyone's mind these days with all the fires. But, going back to that point about non-native trees and competition and whatnot, there is a chapter in the book where he talks about the competition between beech trees and oaks and then various types of pine trees and their different strategies, where beech grow quickly and they can kill an oak, right? Even if they start out small, close to it, they will outcompete and kill the oak. But the oaks are better in more solitary conditions, right? They're slower growing, but they're much more resilient. And then that's the area where they will thrive, and that the beech can't compete with some of the other conifers who are even faster growing, et cetera, et cetera. So, but yeah, when you get non-native species, it throws everything out of whack. And as to whether it's roots being choked out, or competition for water, or a chemical attack, or light deprivation. I mean, I don't know, but I assume it's one or multiples, and I bet you somebody has an answer. Doug.
Yeah, just when she mentioned the buckthorn, it reminded me we've got a black oak in black walnut, I'm sorry, in our neighbor's yard, and we've tried to grow a hedge beside it, and it just keeps killing off the hedge. It just absolutely will do that. And I did a lot of volunteer work with a group, and the DNR brought us in to cut buckthorn all over the place. I mean, in Fort Snelling and all that whole area around the Twin Cities. And then the other thing I wanted to mention when it comes to soil, my wife started a community garden in our area, and we built a permaculture garden. And that's been very successful. And now people compete like crazy to get in that garden. But we did not dig up the soil. We created the soil, with straws and different things and cardboard and you name it. And it was pretty amazing. I'm an old farm kid, and I just didn't think we could make that happen. But it's going great. And like I say, that garden just produces like crazy now. So interesting that you can do that.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so there was a part that I thought was really interesting that kind of filled in a gap in my knowledge, that's kind of on point. And it was that, okay, so photosynthesis focuses on both the red and the blue end of the spectrum, right? And the green is not necessary. It's rejected, which is why leaves look green. Apparently, when you walk around in the forest, you see there's no grass growing, right? but there seems to be enough light often. Well, apparently what's going on is, trees are translucent. So a lot of the light that you're seeing when you're walking around in a thick forest is filtered through the leaves. Hence, it's green tinted light because the leaf has already absorbed all the red and the blue. So we've got plenty of light to see where we're going, but there's not enough of those critical, the red and the blue spectrum for anything to grow down below. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing that, I don't know, is like, oh, okay, that makes sense. David.
I've read, and I don't know, it's certainly out of my area of expertise, but I was intrigued to read that the green light is actually very close energetically to the chemical process that the leaves perform to separate the carbon and the oxygen from carbon dioxide to be able to use the carbon as the basis for the carbohydrates that the plants produce. And so that color pigment absorbs the energy just in the right spectrum for the primary photosynthetic behavior of the plants. And that the reason that the leaves are green is because it does that more efficiently.
Pretty amazing how things all fit together. Almost like it was planned that way, but I'm not going to say that.
Let's just say they compete better if they're a little more efficient.
Well, I know there's been a lot of work for, folks saying, hey, if we could kind of like supercharge, chlorophyll and make it just, a few percent more efficient, the reaction, boy, we'd be in high cotton. And apparently nature's done a pretty good job of optimizing it, or we're not doing a very good job of tweaking it, because
nature on average uses about less than 5% of the solar energy that it impacts on leaves and plants, and it's more like 1 or 2%. And that's more than adequate to have covered the earth with plants. We just want energy a little more.
Well, I'll leave it to people to say, hey, if this is good, what can we do to kind of crank it up just a little bit and make it better? Of course, then who knows what's going to happen? Create a whole new series of disasters. Oh, so one point I did want to make about the video, which I thought was fascinating. It's this idea of these mycorrhizae, where not only are they surrounding the plants or the trees and connecting them in this network, but that it actually penetrates into the plant and is critical in this transport of nutrients. And I got the idea, it reminded me a little bit of, in our cells, we have mitochondria, which are kind of like a separate entity, right? That's in this symbiotic relationship. And it's almost like these fungi are external mitochondria. Just kind of a different way of looking at it, perhaps. But, okay, let's see. Here's the next thing I'm going to chat about here. So another point that's made that I thought was interesting is the idea of forests as water pumps to bring water inland. And he makes the point that, water evaporates off the ocean, clouds come in, once they hit the shore, rain falls. And a lot of that rain would just stop right there if it weren't for trees that then absorb the water, respire, give off moisture, causing more clouds, and those clouds move onshore. So cutting down coastal forests is incredibly detrimental to inland forests and inland life of all sorts, et cetera, et cetera. He also goes into great detail about how in this whole life cycle, deadfall is super important to the health of an ecosystem. I think he said something like 1/5 of all animals depend on dead trees at some level. And then there's this idea of things like beaver. Beaver kill trees, which you think would be a negative to the trees, except for the fact that when they build dams, it creates these reservoirs and it mitigates water loss. And again, it's like a regulatory, reinforcing system that is mutually beneficial for a lot of creatures. It works wonderfully well for fish, gives them shelter, works well for the forests because it creates reservoirs of water and rainfall isn't just eroding the soil, et cetera, and works wonderfully well for the beavers and the other critters. I know a lot of work has been done on this, the idea of, either a sick tree or dying tree or a dead tree often will host a host of animals. You have a woodpecker that'll make a hole in the tree and raise its young there, and then eventually it's not, suitable anymore. It'll move out, and then a nuthatch will move in, and it'll use it for a while until it's no longer suitable, and then an owl will move into that same one, and it's like a, rotating through the apartment complex, so to speak. And that gets into this idea, I think, of forest management, which is kind of where I wanted to, eventually end on the, the conversation. But okay, what did you have to say?
I guess the fact that all these things fit together so well is probably a result of circular adaptation. They adapt to each other. It's not like they have planned this ecologically complex cooperating web. It's that they adapt to each other in turn. The trees adapt to the animals, and the animals adapt to that adaptation of the tree, which then adapts to that adaptation. And it ends up being an incredibly intricate, interwoven system, but it's cyclic adaptation.
I think that's a fantastic way of looking at it. And circular adaptation, is that a formal term of art, or is that something you just made up?
I'm not aware of it being formal.
Well, better copyright that quick. It's a good one. Dean.
Yeah, I love this. Yeah, I love the what was it again? Circular adaptation. And that is how we can, you talk about intelligent design, right? Well, the planet apparently has some kind of intelligent design on its own, right? And circular adaptation, I love it.
Very cool. Yeah. So I guess the final point before I close out just the discussion on the book itself is he gets into this idea of the time frames that trees operate under, where, a mature tree is, 400 or 500 years old. And we're on this much shorter time frame, less than 100, at least so far. We'll see where we end up and how that changes our view, but that's a discussion another time. But this idea that, we think we can go into a barren area or clear cut something, plant a bunch of trees, and then in 50 years or 100 years, you've got a forest, apparently is not accurate. Because again, you don't have the mother trees, you don't have this network, you don't have this established relationship of the old to the young and the sharing and the diversity, et cetera, et cetera. It was the author's opinion that to establish a forest from a clear-cut area takes a minimum of 500 years if you let nature just kind of take its course. And I think that has, profound implications on how we manage forests if we are going to also utilize them as a resource, which seems to be something that's going to happen. right? Nobody's just going to set aside huge swaths of potentially productive land and just say, we're just going to let it be. Even though if you wanted it to be healthy, that's probably what you would do. As soon as you start intervening, you start disrupting, and that causes problems, and those problems take time. Just like the solution to pollution is dilution, you know, the solution to disturbance is time. So I guess the question then is how do you minimize critical disturbances, maintain profitability, and manage the resource in a way that's healthy for the overall system, because that's a net benefit for everybody and everything. And why not maintain that? Barbara.
Yes, thank you. I figured out a way to get my name on there. Thanks.
Awesome.
Yeah. I was just going to say, well, this has been very fascinating to me. Is this the same book? I've heard about it, another book called The Secret Life of Trees. I don't know if this is the subtitle of this book or not.
Is that straight or is that backwards for you?
It's straight.
Okay.
Oh, The Hidden Life of Trees. Okay. Maybe a different author, different rendition. But I just wanted to say, to your point about trees and creating water, I think you called it creating areas with more moisture and water. I recently saw on YouTube a very fascinating video. It was put out, I'm not sure if it was PBS or some scientific group, but it was about in the Sahara Desert, where they are planting trees and maintaining them in almost like a circular, almost looks like a polka dot fashion if you were to look at it from an aerial view, but how each group of individuals who has adopted one of these sort of circle areas, they maintain it and whatnot. And it's not just trees, but it does bring in weeds and other types of plant life, but it has increased the rainfall in the area. And it's really exciting to see that happening in, you know, desert type places that perhaps, and maybe this is where the futurist component of this presentation comes in, is that we can possibly heal our planet. If you want, I sound like a hippie, but I am. But anyway, to bring that, you know, to bring our planet back to life in places where it has not been. And I find that fascinating. So thank you so much, Kerry, for this presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Barbara, I think this is really an important thing. You know, we talk about terraforming other planets. And I've always thought, geez, you know, we should try to get good at that here first, maybe, where it's a little bit easier. And people like to think about how, oh, I want to make the desert green. So I'm going to build a desalination plant and pipe water in here and do this and do, you know, super labor intensive, super resource intensive, super energy intensive, and really expensive, right? Would it work? I don't know, maybe. But how cool if you could do it just by planting the right things at the right time in the right place and let nature kind of do its own thing, right? And that seems to be what you're describing exactly is, you know, and my understanding is, at least with the Sahara Desert, that it goes through periodic cycles where it used to be forested.
Right.
And the climate kind of, it has this oscillation that goes back and forth. So if you understood how that process naturally took place and you could jumpstart it and maybe ease it along, you know, you could be creating new vibrant environments, you know, for a lot less cost than just trying to force it mechanically. So I think that's fascinating, and I will definitely be looking at that.
Great.
H-Tom.
Yeah, we don't usually think of lumber in the correct way. We think of it as a thing you go to the store and buy. But another way of thinking of it is that it's a part of a tree. And there are rowing boats made in the Pacific Northwest, used to be made from slabs of cedar. You take your big cedar log, you cut it down the middle, then you cut a piece that's 5 feet wide, 3/8 of an inch thick, and 30 feet long. One piece of cedar. Grain growth ring 20 to an inch. You then steam this and fold it, and you get an incredibly strong, lightweight rowing shell for competitive rowing. It took 1,200 years to grow that tree. This is not something that humans are used to time frame that humans are used to thinking of.
It's a good point. I actually spoke with somebody at a party a few years back who was had some expertise in forestry. I forget exactly what he did, but I was somehow we got on the topic of cedar because that is a local product here. And he's saying, you know, you go to Home Depot, you want to build a fence and you buy the, you know, the cedar wood. And he's saying essentially these days you're paying for a whole lot of nothing because it's not rot resistant anymore. This stuff is all fast growth, young growth, and it was the old growth stuff that actually had that property. And I can see that in the wood that I've put up where, you know, in a few years it's rotten just as bad as if I'd used Doug fir. So yeah, your point is well taken that these old growth is not something that renews its. I mean, it is a renewable resource sort of, but on a time frame that we're not used to. And you know, you can't just walk in there and just bulldoze the whole place and expect it to grow back in a hurry. Tom.
Yeah, you're talking about the old growth. I think this goes back to what you were talking about earlier, that the mother trees can restrict the nutrients to their daughters, make them grow more slowly, but therefore be stronger in the long run. And when you look at the lumber that comes out now, the growth rings are very far apart. They grow very fast, whereas the old lumber is much denser and stronger. So yeah, that's been happening for a while now. I just wanted to mention that circular adaptation is not a neologism. It's been around for a while. It's often used in economic terms, but it can also be used in ecological terms, like what we're doing here. I just Googled it, and the Google AI came up with a short explanation. I just posted part of that in the chat. So
thank you. Yeah, I think that that I like where our understanding of these of systems biology is going. You know, it seems like we're trying finally hitting, you know, this critical mass where we have enough of a foundation to really start to understand this interconnected web of development and how, you know, it's like a Jenga tower, right? You know, you pull out one thing and it has potentially dramatic consequences up the chain. You know, not that we'll necessarily be able to anticipate all of those, but at least being mindful, you know, we can keep an eye out. Carol.
Yes. Someone, a few people back, mentioned the Sahara as a cyclic thing. And my understanding of the dry Sahara and the mess that used to be the Fertile Crescent. I mean, you know, we get the phrase from biblical times, the cedars of Lebanon. There ain't any cedars in Lebanon anymore. And my understanding is that the the desertification of these areas was largely due to the herding and raising of goats and sheep rather than cattle in areas that were somewhat low in water. Because you got no trouble growing sheep in England. You know, it lots of water and very green. But if you try to grow them in an area that's marginal in water, they'll dig up the plant, dig it out by the roots and eat it, rather than, as cattle do, just eating down to the soil and leaving it to grow again.
Well, yeah, goats are brutal on young trees. They will girdle them.
Well, so will rabbits.
That's true.
I mean, remember the Australia, you know, with rabbit-proof fences and all that kind of stuff. I mean, some animals are safe in a high water environment, and they're not safe in a semi-desert environment. And this led to all the wars in the American West between the cattle herders and the sheep and goats guys.
Great point. Jason. You are muted.
Yeah, I know. I had to unmute myself. Maybe you've heard, maybe some of you have heard, in China, in the desert, one of their great western deserts. It's not the Gobi. I'm trying to remember which one. They've got a lot of deserts in China. They have spent decades building trees and plants around a desert to stop the spread of this desert.